The morning briefing at Edwards Air Force Base felt different today. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Hayes sat in the back row of the sterile conference room, clipboard balanced on her knee, watching the flight crew joke around near the coffee machine. At 28, she'd learned to blend into backgrounds. It was safer that way in the military. "All right, listen up," barked Captain Rick Davidson, the mission commander. His weathered face bore the arrogance of someone who'd never been told. "No? We're hauling medical supplies and communications equipment to Forward Operating Base Delta. Standard milk run, but the weather's questionable." Rebecca noticed how he emphasized "we" while his eyes deliberately avoided her section of the room. She'd been assigned as cargo manifest escort, essentially a glorified box counter, according to Davidson's dismissive briefing yesterday. "Hayes," Davidson's voice cut through the room like a blade, "you're just here to babysit paperwork. Stay out of our way, keep your mouth shut, and maybe you'll learn something about real flying." First Lieutenant Tommy Brennan, the eager co-pilot fresh out of flight school, snickered. "Don't worry, Sarge. We'll try not to scare you with any fancy maneuvers." Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd heard worse. What they didn't know, what her personnel file carefully omitted, was that she'd logged over 200 hours piloting cargo aircraft in classified operations before a bureaucratic reshuffling had buried her credentials. Her commanding officer at the time had promised it was temporary, just until the paperwork sorted itself out. That was 3 years ago. Technical Sergeant Mike Torres, the loadmaster, glanced at her with something that might have been sympathy. He was older, quieter, and seemed uncomfortable with Davidson's attitude. When their eyes met, he offered a slight nod before turning back to his checklist. The fourth crew member, Airman First Class Danny Walsh, was barely old enough to shave. He clutched his flight manual like a security blanket and kept stealing glances at Rebecca as if trying to figure out why she was there. "Weather report shows possible wind shear over the mountain pass," Torres mentioned, his voice careful. "Might want to consider the alternate route." Davidson waved him off. "I've flown this route 50 times, Torres. A little wind never hurt." "Anybody! We stick to the flight plan." Rebecca's pen paused over her manifest. She'd studied the meteorological data that morning, something she did out of habit, not requirement. The satellite imagery showed a developing low-pressure system that could create dangerous downdrafts in the mountain corridors. She opened her mouth to mention it, then caught Davidson's warning glare. "Something to add, Hayes?" His tone dripped with condescension. "No, sir. Just reviewing the cargo manifest." "Good. That's what you're here for." As the crew filed out, toward the aircraft, Rebecca lingered, studying the weather charts left on the table. The wind patterns were worse than Torres had mentioned. Much worse. She pulled out her phone and quietly photographed the data, old habits from her previous life as an actual pilot. Outside, the C-130 Hercules sat on the tarmac like a gray whale, its 4 turboprops gleaming in the morning sun. Rebecca had flown. Birds like this before knew every rivet and wire, every sound the engines made when they were happy or stressed. The aircraft looked solid, but she noticed small details the others missed. A slight hydraulic leak near the nose gear, tire wear, that suggested recent hard landings. Torres was already securing the cargo. He looked up as she approached. "You ever work logistics before?" "Something like that," she replied, not wanting to lie but unable to tell the whole truth. "You seem to know your way around these birds." Before she could respond, Davidson's voice echoed from the cockpit. "Hayes, your babysitting station is in the back, and Torres, hurry up with those straps. I want wheels up in 10. Rebecca settled into her assigned seat near the cargo bay, strapping in with practiced efficiency. Through the small porthole, she watched the ground crew complete their final checks. Everything looked routine, professional, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the engines spooled up, their familiar whine filling the cabin, Brennan's voice crackled over the intercom. "Hope you're not afraid of flying, Hayes. This old bird can get a little bumpy." Rebecca didn't respond. She was too busy listening to the engines, noting the slight irregularity in the number 3 turboprop that nobody else seemed to hear. Her fingers drummed against her clipboard, not nervously but methodically, the way a pianist might practice scales. The C-130 began its taxi toward the runway, and Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the familiar rhythm of an aircraft coming alive. In a few hours, they'd be at the forward operating base. What could go wrong on a simple milk run? She was about to find out that in the military, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, and sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly who you need when everything goes sideways. The flight started smoothly enough. Once they reached cruising altitude, Davidson's voice boomed over the intercom with characteristic arrogance. "Beautiful day for flying, gentlemen. And lady," he added with mock courtesy. "Hayes, you getting a good education back there?" Rebecca had been monitoring the cargo straps, noting how the medical equipment containers were shifting slightly more than they should. The tie-downs were regulation tight, but the weight distribution felt off. She'd seen it before. Poorly balanced loads that could shift dangerously in turbulence. "Copy that, Captain," she replied evenly. Brennan laughed over the radio. "She's so formal. Relax, Hayes. This isn't boot camp." What they didn't know was that Rebecca was anything but relaxed. Her trained eye had caught several concerning details. The hydraulic pressure gauge in the cockpit read slightly low when she'd glimpsed it during boarding. The weather radar showed storm cells building along their route, and Torres kept glancing at his instruments with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. 20 minutes into the flight, the first real problem emerged. "Torres, you seeing this vibration in the cargo bay?" Davidson's voice had lost some of its swagger. "Affirmative. Feels like load shift." Rebecca was already moving, unstrapping herself to inspect the cargo. The medical supply crate, marked Urgent Cardiac Unit, had worked one of its restraints. Loose. The expensive equipment inside was worth more than most people's houses, and if it shifted during landing, it could destroy itself and damage the aircraft. "I can resecure it," she called toward the cockpit. "Negative," Davidson snapped. "That's Torres's job. You stay put." But Torres was strapped in for instrument approach procedures, and Rebecca could see the restraint wasn't just loose. It was failing. The metal bracket had a stress fracture that would only get worse. "Captain, that bracket's compromised. If we hit turbulence—" "Hayes, I said stay in your seat. That's an order." She watched the crate rock gently with each air pocket, the damaged bracket flexing dangerously. Her hands clenched around her clipboard. She knew how to fix it, had done it dozens of times before, but Davidson's ego wouldn't let the cargo Escort do anything important. Walsh noticed her concern and leaned forward. "Maybe we should let her—" "Shut it, Walsh," Davidson cut him off. "I don't need a pencil pusher telling us how to secure cargo." The irony was bitter. Rebecca had more experience with cargo operations than the rest of the crew combined, but her current classification made her invisible. She pulled out her phone and quietly documented the failing restraint, time-stamping the photos. If something went wrong, there would be evidence. Torres finally unstrapped and moved to check the cargo. His face went pale when he saw the bracket. "Captain, she's right. This is about to fail completely." A long pause. Then Davidson's voice, tight with irritation. "Fine, fix it. But Hayes stays out of the way." Torres worked quickly, but Rebecca could see he was struggling. The replacement bracket required a specific technique. You had to pre-stress the mount to account for load dynamics during flight maneuvers. It was advanced cargo management, not standard training. "Torque it to spec, then back off a quarter turn," Rebecca said quietly. Torres looked at her sharply. "What?" "The mount flexes during bank turns. If you over-tighten it, the bracket shears. Under lateral stress—" "How do you— Torres!" Davidson's voice crackled with anger. "What's the holdup?" "Almost finished, sir." Torres followed Rebecca's advice, and the mount seated properly. He gave her a questioning look, but before he could ask where she'd learned cargo engineering, they hit the first real turbulence. The C-130 bucked like an angry horse. Everyone grabbed for handholds as the aircraft pitched and rolled. In the cockpit, alarms started beeping. "What the hell?" Brennan's voice pitched high with stress. Rebecca was already looking out the porthole. The mountain peaks ahead were shrouded in roiling clouds, and the aircraft was shaking harder than it should for normal turbulence. This was wind shear, exactly what the weather data had predicted. "Captain," Torres called forward, "recommend?" We divert to the alternate route. Negative, we're not running from a little chop. But this wasn't a little chop. Rebecca had flown through enough mountain weather to recognize the signs. The wind patterns were chaotic, dangerous. She could feel it in the aircraft's response, the way it fought the controls, the irregular buffeting that meant they were flying into a storm system that could tear them apart. She quietly activated her phone's voice recorder and spoke into it, barely audible. 1347 hours, experiencing severe wind shear approximately 40 miles from destination. Recommend immediate course correction to alternate route Delta 7. It was the kind of detailed observation that came from experience Davidson didn't know she had. Walsh looked green around the gills as another violent shake rattled. The aircraft. Maybe we should... Walsh, if you're going to be sick, use the bag, Davidson snapped. And everyone else, shut up. I'm trying to fly here. Rebecca exchanged glances with Torres. They both knew Davidson was in over his head, but military hierarchy meant they were stuck watching him make potentially fatal decisions. As the mountains loomed ahead, shrouded in storm clouds that looked like reaching fingers, Rebecca began mentally calculating alternate landing sites. Because she had a growing certainty they were going to need one. The worst part wasn't the danger. It was sitting helplessly while someone else's pride put all their lives at risk. But Rebecca had learned patience in her previous life. Sometimes you had to wait for the right moment to act. That moment was coming sooner than any of them expected. The weather deteriorated rapidly as they approached the mountain pass. What had been moderate turbulence became violent shaking that rattled every bolt in the aircraft. Rebecca gripped her seat as the C-130 pitched wildly, thrown around by wind currents that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Jesus!" Brennan's voice cracked over the intercom. "Captain, we need to abort." "Hold your course," Davidson snarled back, but Rebecca could hear the strain in his voice. "It's just mountain wave turbulence." It wasn't. Rebecca had studied the weather patterns that morning, and this was exactly the kind of severe downdraft system that had claimed aircraft before. The mountains were funneling wind into a deadly corridor, and they were flying straight into it. The aircraft suddenly dropped 50 feet in an air pocket. Walsh made a strangled sound and fumbled for his air sickness bag. The cargo containers groaned against their restraints, and Rebecca heard the ominous sound of metal stress testing itself. "Captain!" Torres called from his position, voice tight with concern. "We're getting load shift warnings. These containers aren't going to hold if this keeps up." "Then secure them better." But there was no better way to secure cargo that was being thrown around by forces that exceeded design specifications. Rebecca watched the precious medical equipment containers, including that cardiac unit bound for soldiers who needed it, strain against their mounts. If they broke free, they could become projectiles that would kill everyone aboard. Through the porthole, she caught glimpses of the terrain below. Jagged peaks disappeared into churning clouds. There was nowhere to land for miles in any direction, except their intended destination, Forward Operating Base Delta, perched on a plateau that was rapidly becoming invisible in the storm. "Base Delta, this is Cargo 77. Davidson's voice crackled over the radio, requesting immediate weather update. Static. Then, "Cargo 77, weather has deteriorated beyond safe landing parameters. Recommend you divert to alternate. Field." "Negative, Base Delta. We have priority medical cargo. Continuing approach." Rebecca's blood went cold. Priority medical cargo was exactly what they were carrying, but that didn't mean they had to die delivering it. There were protocols for weather diversions, established procedures that existed specifically to prevent the kind of disaster they were flying toward. She quietly pulled out her phone and opened the weather app. The satellite view showed the storm system had intensified beyond all predictions. The mountain passes were choked with turbulence that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Another violent shake threw everyone against their restraints. This time, Rebecca heard something she'd hoped never to hear again. The subtle change in engine pitch that meant they were fighting wind shear beyond the aircraft's design limits. "Captain," she called forward, "request permission to review the weather data." "Hayes, you're not qualified to read weather reports." But she was. More qualified than anyone else on the aircraft, as it turned out. Her previous assignment had included specialized training in mountain weather interpretation, knowledge that was buried in classified files Davidson had never seen. Walsh was looking pale and scared. Torres caught her eye and mouthed the word, "Help!" Even Brennan, for all his bravado, sounded increasingly panicked over the radio. The decisive moment came when the aircraft encountered a severe downdraft that dropped them 200 feet in seconds. The medical equipment containers broke free from their primary restraints, held only by the secondary cables that were never meant to take full load. "We're losing cargo!" Torres shouted. "Captain Davidson," Rebecca's voice cut through the chaos, calm and authoritative, "you need to abort this approach immediately. The wind shear is exceeding aircraft limits." "Shut up, Hayes! Your cargo!" "Escort, not crew!" But her tone had changed. Gone was the deferential sergeant following orders. This was the voice of someone who'd commanded aircraft in conditions that would terrify seasoned pilots. Torres noticed the change immediately. There was something in Rebecca's bearing that suggested she knew exactly what she was talking about. "Sir," Torres added quietly, "maybe we should listen to her." "Are you questioning my command, Sergeant?" The aircraft bucked again, harder this time. Through the cockpit door, Rebecca could see Brennan struggling with the controls. His knuckles were white on the yoke, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool cabin air. This was the moment Rebecca had to make a choice. Stay in her. Assigned role and watch them all die, or reveal what she really was and risk everything. She unbuckled her harness and stood, moving forward with the steady gait of someone accustomed to aircraft in crisis. "Captain Davidson, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Get back in your seat. I've flown this route before, in worse weather than this, and if you don't turn this aircraft around in the next 60 seconds, we're all going to die." The quiet certainty in her voice made everyone freeze. Even Davidson turned to look at her, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "You've never flown anything, Hayes. You're just—" "I'm the pilot they don't want you to know about," Rebecca said simply. "And right. Now that medical equipment you're so worried about delivering won't help anyone if we're scattered across these mountains." The aircraft shuddered again, and this time the number 3 engine coughed ominously. Time was running out, and Rebecca was done playing the role of helpless observer. What happened next would determine whether they lived to see another sunrise. The revelation hung in the air like a live wire. Rebecca stood in the aircraft's narrow aisle, her stance balanced and confident, despite the violent turbulence, while Davidson stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You're lying," he said flatly. "Check my file." Rebecca's voice remained calm. "Service record 2018 to 2021, classified operations. 197 hours piloting C-130s in Afghanistan, including mountain weather that makes this look like a gentle breeze." Torres was already moving toward the cockpit's computer terminal. In the military, personnel records were accessible to senior crew during active missions, a safety protocol in case of crew incapacitation. "Don't you dare!" Davidson snapped at Torres, but the loadmaster was already typing Rebecca's service number into the system. His eyes widened as the classified sections of her file populated on screen. "Captain, she's telling the truth. She's rated on this aircraft. Multiple commendations for flying in extreme conditions." Walsh looked back and forth between them, confused. "Then why is she—" "Because 3 years ago, someone decided that female pilots were bad for unit cohesion," Rebecca said quietly. "I was reassigned to logistics support while they sorted out the politics. The sorting never happened." Brennan's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with panic. "Whatever you're discussing back there, we need to decide now." "I'm losing control authority." Through the cockpit door, Rebecca could see the young co-pilot fighting the controls. The aircraft was pitching and rolling unpredictably, caught in wind currents that were beyond his skill level. Davidson was frozen, his pride warring with the growing realization that his decisions had put them all in mortal danger. "Captain," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through his paralysis, "you have 2 choices. Let me help, or explain to our families why you let your ego kill us all." For a moment, the only sounds were the aircraft's groaning and the whistle of wind through stressed metal. Then Torres made the decision for all of them. "Rebecca," he said, using her first name for the first time, "what do you need?" Access to the controls and weather radar. We're not aborting. We're going to thread the needle. Davidson's face went purple. You can't just... I can, and I will. Rebecca was already moving toward the cockpit. Brennan, I'm coming forward. Keep her level as best you can. Who are you? The co-pilot asked, confusion evident in his voice. Someone who's done this before. As Rebecca slid into the jump seat behind the pilots, she quickly assessed the situation. The weather radar showed massive storm cells converging on their position, but there was a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for the C-130, that offered a possible path through. There, she pointed to the radar display. See that gap? It's only going to be open for about 5 minutes before the storm systems merge. Brennan squinted at the screen. That's impossibly narrow. No, it's difficult. There's a difference. Her hands hovered over the backup controls, muscle memory from hundreds of hours returning, despite 3 years of forced inactivity. The aircraft's responses felt familiar, like greeting an old friend. I need you to transfer control to the backup station, she told Brennan. I can't do that without the captain's order. Then get it, Rebecca said simply. All eyes turned to Davidson. His career was built on never showing weakness, never admitting he was wrong. But as another violent downdraft slammed the aircraft, sending unsecured items flying through the cabin, the mathematics of survival began to outweigh the politics of pride. Captain, Torres said quietly, she knows this bird better than any of us. Walsh nodded frantically. Please, sir, I've got a wife and baby girl waiting for me. Davidson's hands clenched into fists. Everything in his worldview said that admitting a female sergeant could outfly him was tantamount to professional suicide. But the alternative was literal suicide. Fine, he said through gritted teeth, but if you crash my aircraft... I won't, Rebecca said with quiet confidence. Brennan, transfer control. Now. As the backup controls came online, Rebecca felt the familiar weight of an aircraft responding to her touch. The C-130 was still bucking and rolling, but now she could feel its intentions, understand what it was trying to tell her about the air currents around them. Torres, I need you to redistribute the cargo load. Move the medical containers aft. By 2 positions, we need the center of gravity shifted for the kind of flying we're about to do. On it. Walsh, monitor our fuel consumption. We're going to be making some turns that drink gas. Yes, ma'am. As her crew, and they were her crew now, she realized, jumped into action, Rebecca studied the narrow gap in the storm system. It would require precision flying that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits, but it was possible. What she didn't tell them was that 3 years ago she'd flown through worse conditions to deliver medical supplies to a forward operating base under enemy fire. That mission had earned her a commendation that was buried in classified files. Today's mission would either prove she still had what it took or end all their careers permanently. Time to find out which. Rebecca's hands settled on the controls with the certainty of someone returning home. The C-130 responded immediately to her touch, the violent bucking smoothing into controlled flight, despite the churning air around them. How is she doing that? Walsh whispered to Torres. Experience, Torres replied, watching Rebecca's hands move over the instruments with practiced precision. Look at her. She's not fighting the turbulence. She's using it. It was true. Where Brennan had been wrestling with the controls, trying to force the aircraft into submission, Rebecca was working with the air currents. She found the smooth patches between the violent downdrafts, riding thermals like a surfer finding the perfect wave. Base Delta, this is Cargo 77, she said into the radio, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Be advised, we are continuing approach through the weather corridor. Expect arrival in 12 minutes. Cargo 77 negative. Weather conditions are beyond safe parameters. Copy that, Base Delta. We're not flying safe parameters. We're flying smart ones. Davidson sat rigid in his seat, watching his career evaporate with every smooth maneuver Rebecca executed. She was making it look easy. Flying that should have been impossible for anyone, certainly impossible for a cargo escort who wasn't supposed to know which end of the aircraft went forward. But Rebecca wasn't just flying. She was teaching. "Brennan, watch the pressure differential on the altimeter. See how it fluctuates before we hit turbulence? That's your early warning system." The young co-pilot leaned forward, fascinated despite his terror. "I never noticed that before." "Most people don't. It takes a few hundred hours in mountain weather to develop the eye for it." "How many hours do you have?" he asked. "Enough." What she didn't say was that those hours had been earned in some of the most dangerous flying conditions on Earth: combat missions, mercy flights, search and rescue operations that pushed aircraft and crew beyond their design limits. The kind of experience that couldn't be taught in simulators or classrooms. Torres had finished redistributing the cargo and returned to his station. "Load's balanced. How did you know to move it aft?" "Weight distribution affects how the aircraft responds," to Weinshia. "Too much weight forward, and you lose elevator authority in downdrafts. Too much aft, and you get tail stall in updrafts. They don't teach that in Loadmaster school. They should." Through the windscreen, the storm-shrouded mountains began to emerge from the clouds. Base Delta's landing strip was barely visible through the swirling mist, but Rebecca could see it clearly, a narrow ribbon of concrete perched on a plateau that looked impossibly small from their altitude. "There's no way we can land in this," Davidson said, his voice hollow. "Yes, there is," Rebecca replied, "but not with a standard approach." She began a descending spiral that used the mountain's wind patterns to slow their descent. It was an advanced technique that required split-second timing and perfect knowledge of how air moved around terrain features. "This is insane," Brennan muttered, but his voice held admiration rather than fear. "This is flying," Rebecca corrected. "What we were doing before was just falling with style." As they descended through the cloud layer, the landing strip came into full view. It looked even smaller than Rebecca remembered, surrounded by peaks that rose like jagged teeth into the storm. But she'd landed on shorter strips in worse weather. "Base Delta, Cargo 77 on final approach. Clear the runway and have medical. Teams standing by." "Cargo 77, who is this? You don't sound like Captain Davidson." Rebecca glanced at Davidson, who was staring out the window with the expression of a man watching his worldview collapse. She keyed the radio again. "Base Delta, this is Staff Sergeant Rebecca Hayes taking control due to weather conditions beyond the primary crew's capabilities." Silence on the radio. Then, "Say again, Cargo 77, did you say, Staff Sergeant?" "Affirmative, the medical. Supplies will be delivered as scheduled." Behind her she heard Walsh chuckle nervously. "This is either going to be the best landing ever, or the last one we ever make." "It's going to be perfect," Torres said quietly. He'd been watching Rebecca work, and there was something in her movements that spoke of absolute competence. She knows exactly what she's doing. As they lined up for final approach, Rebecca realized that everything was about to change. Word would spread quickly through the base about the female sergeant who'd taken control of a C-130 in impossible weather. There would be questions, investigations, career ramifications for everyone involved. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, there was only the aircraft, the weather, and the landing strip that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. "Gear down," she called. "Gear down and locked," Brennan responded, his voice steady now. He was learning to trust her. "Flaps to landing configuration." "Flaps set." The C-130 descended through the last layer of turbulence, settling into the smooth approach that Rebecca had been visualizing since they entered the weather system. Everything was coming together exactly as she'd planned. What none of them could have predicted was the audience waiting for them on the ground. The landing was flawless. Rebecca brought the C-130 down through the swirling winds with the precision of a surgeon, touching down on the center line of the narrow strip with barely a bump. The aircraft rolled out smoothly, engines winding down as she applied brakes with just the right pressure to stop them well short of the runway's end. "Jesus Christ," Brennan breathed. That was beautiful." In the cargo bay, Torres was already unbuckling his harness, a grin spreading across his weathered face. "Best landing I've experienced in 20 years of flying." Even Walsh looked impressed, his fear replaced by something approaching awe. "Ma'am, where did you learn? To fly like that?" But Davidson sat silent, his face a mask of barely controlled rage and humiliation. Everything he'd believed about his own superiority had been shattered in the space of 30 minutes. As the engines spooled down, Rebecca began the post-flight checklist with the same calm efficiency she'd shown throughout the crisis, but she could see ground personnel gathering outside the aircraft more than the usual cargo handling crew. "Looks like we've got company," Torres observed, peering out a porthole. Through the windscreen, Rebecca could see a cluster of officers approaching the aircraft. Among them was Colonel James Peterson, the base commander, a man whose reputation for no-nonsense leadership was legendary throughout the Air Force. "This is bad," Davidson muttered. "This is very bad." "For you, maybe," Torres said quietly. "Not for her." The ramp lowered with its characteristic hydraulic whine, and the first person to board was Colonel Peterson himself. He was a compact man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Behind him came Major Lisa Rodriguez, the base operations officer, and Captain Kevin Thompson from Flight Safety. Davidson stood immediately, his posture rigidly military. "Colonel Peterson, sir, I can explain." "Can you?" Peterson's voice was deceptively calm. "Because what I heard on the radio was that Staff Sergeant Hayes took control of your aircraft. Is that accurate?" "Sir, the situation was—" "I'm not asking you, Captain." Peterson's gaze shifted to Rebecca, who had remained seated at the controls, completing her shutdown procedures. "Sergeant Hayes?" Rebecca secured the last switch and turned to face the colonel. "Yes, sir. I assumed control when weather conditions exceeded the crew's capabilities." "And you're qualified on this aircraft?" "Yes, sir, though not officially assigned as flight crew." Peterson nodded slowly. "Major Rodriguez, pull Sergeant Hayes' complete service record. Captain Thompson, I want a full investigation of this incident. And Captain Davidson," his voice hardened, "you're grounded pending review." Davidson's face went white. "Colonel, this is highly irregular. A sergeant cannot watch a crew risk lives due to incompetence without acting." Peterson cut him off. "Or would you prefer I explain to families why their loved ones died because you were too proud to accept help?" The silence that followed was deafening. Walsh and Brennan stood frozen, uncertain whether they were about to witness careers ending or beginning. Torres stepped forward. "Colonel, if I may, Sergeant Hayes saved our lives. Captain Davidson refused to abort when conditions became dangerous, and without her intervention we would have crashed." "Is that your assessment, Sergeant Torres?" "Yes, sir. Absolutely." Peterson turned to Brennan. "Lieutenant?" The young co-pilot glanced nervously at Davidson, then straightened his shoulders. "The sergeant's flying was exceptional, sir. Better than anything I've seen in flight training." "And you, Airman Walsh?" "She was amazing, sir. Cool as ice. Knew exactly what to do." Peterson absorbed this, then looked back at Rebecca. "Sergeant, you're aware that taking control of an aircraft without proper authorization is a serious—" "Offense?" "Yes, sir." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes, sir. The alternative was letting everyone die." For the first time, Peterson's stern expression cracked slightly. "Major Rodriguez, what does her service record show?" Rodriguez had been scanning her tablet throughout the conversation. Her eyebrows rose as she read. "Sir, Sergeant Hayes has extensive flight time on C-130s, including combat operations. Her ratings were allegedly transferred to logistics due to administrative restructuring 3 years ago." "Allegedly?" "There's no clear documentation of why the transfer occurred, sir. Her flight evaluations were all exemplary." Peterson's expression darkened. He'd been in the Air Force long enough to recognize bureaucratic games when he saw them. Someone had buried a qualified pilot for reasons that had nothing to do with competence. "Captain Davidson," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "you were told you had an experienced pilot assigned to your crew, and you chose to treat her as a cargo handler." "Sir, her assignment clearly stated her assignment was wrong." Peterson's words hit like hammer blows. "And your pride nearly killed 5 people and destroyed a multi-million-dollar aircraft. He turned back to Rebecca. "Sergeant Hayes, effective immediately, you're reassigned to flight operations. Major Rodriguez will process the paperwork restoring your flight status." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. You're also facing disciplinary action for insubordination." Rebecca nodded calmly. "Understood, sir." "However," Peterson continued, "given the circumstances and the testimony of your crew, I'm recommending that any disciplinary action be suspended in favor of a commendation for exceptional performance under pressure." Davidson made a strangled sound. "Sir, this sets a dangerous precedent." "The dangerous precedent," Peterson interrupted, "is allowing incompetent officers to endanger lives because they're too arrogant to recognize superior skill regardless of rank or gender." He stepped closer to Davidson. "You're facing a formal investigation, Captain. I suggest you use the time to consider whether your ego is worth more than the lives of your crew." As the officers filed off the aircraft, Torres clapped Rebecca on the shoulder. "Well, that was interesting." Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. "It's not over yet. There'll be more investigations, more questions." "Let them ask," Walsh said firmly. "We know what really happened here." Brennan nodded agreement. "You saved our lives. That's all that matters." But Rebecca knew it was more complicated than that. She'd broken protocol, challenged authority, and forced a reckoning with a system that had tried to bury her talents. The aftermath would be messy, political, and potentially career-ending for multiple people. Still, as she looked at the faces of her crew now, not Davidson's, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the satisfaction of flying where she belonged. The investigation took 3 weeks, 3 weeks of interviews, testimony, and bureaucratic maneuvering that reached all the way to the Pentagon. Rebecca found herself at the center of a storm that had less to do with aviation and more to do with the military's ongoing struggle with gender equality and institutional change. Colonel Peterson had been true to his word. Rebecca's flight status was restored, and she was reassigned to active flight operations at Edwards. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. "Sergeant Hayes," Major Rodriguez knocked on the door of Rebecca's temporary quarters. "You have visitors." Rebecca looked up from the flight manual she'd been studying, reacquainting herself with procedures she'd been forced to forget. "Visitors?" "The crew from Cargo 77. Torres, Brennan, and Walsh stood in the hallway, looking uncharacteristically formal. Torres held a manila folder thick with documents. "Mind if we come in?" Torres asked. Rebecca's quarters were standard military issue, functional but Spartan. The 3 men filed in and stood awkwardly until she gestured for them to sit. "How did the investigation go for you guys?" she asked. "Clean," Brennan said immediately. "Completely exonerated. Turns out when you tell the truth about someone saving your life, the investigators tend to believe you." Walsh nodded vigorously. "They asked us the same questions about 50 different ways, but our story never changed because it was what actually happened." Torres opened his folder. "That's actually why we're here. The investigation turned up some interesting information about your career adjustment 3 years ago." Rebecca's stomach tightened. She'd suspected there was more to her reassignment than simple administrative reshuffling, but she'd never been able to prove it. "What kind of information?" Torres pulled out several documents. It turns out Captain Davidson wasn't the first officer who complained about having a female pilot under his command. 3 years ago, Major William Kane, Davidson's mentor, filed a formal complaint claiming that female pilots were a distraction in combat zones. "That's not unusual," Rebecca said quietly. "Those complaints come up regularly." "But this one was different," Brennan interjected, "because Major Kane had influence with the Personnel Review Board. He managed to get several female pilots reassigned to support roles under the guise of administrative efficiency." Walsh leaned forward. "Including you. Your reassignment wasn't random. It was targeted." Rebecca stared at the documents. Her suspicions were confirmed, but it felt hollow somehow. 3 years of her life, 3 years of being treated like she didn't belong in a cockpit, all because someone with power had decided her gender mattered more than her skills. "There's more," Torres said gently. "The investigation also revealed that the medical emergency we delivered that day, the cardiac unit for the field hospital." "What about it?" "It saved the life of Private First Class Maria Santos, 22 years old, mother of twin boys. She had a massive heart attack during a training exercise. Without that equipment," he shrugged, "the doctors said she would have died." The weight of that hit Rebecca harder than she'd expected. Their dangerous flight, the confrontation with Davidson, the career upheaval, it had all led to saving someone's life. Someone with a family, a future, dreams that almost ended on a remote mountaintop. "How is she?" Rebecca asked. "Recovering. Full medical discharge, but she's alive and going home to her kids." Brennan smiled. "She asked us to give you this." He handed Rebecca a handwritten note. The paper was cheap hospital stationery, the handwriting shaky but determined. "Sergeant Hayes, I heard what you did to get my heart to me. I don't know you, but my boys Joshua and Marcus will grow up with their mama because of your courage. Thank you for not letting them be orphans. You're a hero. Maria Santos." Rebecca's vision blurred slightly. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her shirt pocket. "There's one more thing," Torres said. "Colonel Peterson wanted us to give you this." He handed her an official envelope with her name typed across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, orders for a new assignment. Rebecca read it twice before the words sank in. "Test pilot program at Edwards?" "Experimental aircraft development," Walsh said, grinning. "Apparently your unconventional flying techniques caught the attention of some people in very high places." "But I'm just a staff sergeant." "Not anymore," Torres interrupted. "Check the bottom of the page." There it was, in official military. Typeface, "Promotion to Technical Sergeant, effective immediately, with assignment to the 412th Test Wing's Advanced Flight Research Division." "They're giving you the controls of aircraft that don't even have names yet," Brennan said admiringly. "Prototypes, experimental designs, cutting-edge stuff." Rebecca stared at the orders, hardly daring to believe it. Test pilot work was the pinnacle of military aviation, reserved for the best of the best, pilots who could push machines and themselves beyond known limits. "What about Davidson?" she asked. Torres's expression hardened. "Court-martialed. Stripped of flight status permanently. Turns out endangering your crew while refusing assistance isn't looked upon favorably by military justice." "And Major Kane?" "Early retirement. Highly encouraged." Walsh's tone suggested the encouragement had been emphatic. Rebecca looked at the three men who had stood by her when it mattered most. "Why did you guys testify for me? You could have stayed neutral, protected your own careers." Torres shrugged. "Because you saved our lives. Because you were right and Davidson was wrong. Because sometimes doing the right thing matters more than protecting yourself. Plus," Brennan added with a grin, "you're the best pilot any of us have ever flown with. It would have been criminal to let the military waste that talent." Walsh nodded agreement. "My daughter's going to grow up in a world where maybe her gender won't determine her career opportunities. People like you are making that possible." As they prepared to leave, Torres turned back. "Rebecca, we're all pulling for you in the test program. Don't let them intimidate you. You belong there." After they left, Rebecca sat alone in her quarters, holding the orders that would change her life. Outside her window, she could see aircraft taking off from Edwards, fighters, transports, and sleek experimental craft that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Tomorrow she would start a new chapter, not as a cargo escort or a logistics coordinator, but as what she'd always been meant to be, a pilot who could fly anything with wings. The note from Maria Santos crinkled softly in her pocket, a reminder that sometimes the most important flights are the ones nobody sees coming. 6 months later, the X-47B prototype gleamed in the morning sun like a metallic dragonfly, its unconventional design a testament to the future of aviation. Rebecca stood beside it on the Edwards test flight line, running through her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. All systems green, Sergeant Hayes, called out Chief Master Sergeant Robert Kim, the test flight engineer. Weather is optimal for the evaluation flight. Copy that, Chief. Rebecca's voice carried the quiet confidence that had replaced the careful deference of her cargo escort days. Initiating startup sequence. As she climbed into the cockpit of the experimental aircraft, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed since that stormy day over the mountains. The test pilot program had pushed her skills beyond anything she'd imagined possible, flying aircraft that existed at the bleeding edge of aerospace technology. Her radio crackled to life. Test Bird 7, this is Control. You're cleared for takeoff when ready. Test Bird 7, copy. Rolling. The prototype lifted off smoothly, responding to her touch with the hypersensitive precision of a thoroughbred. As she climbed into the clear desert sky, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. This was where she belonged, not counting cargo containers or sitting quietly in the back, but pushing the envelope of what was possible. Control, Test Bird 7 is airborne and climbing through 5,000 feet. All systems nominal. Copy. Test Bird 7, take her through the evaluation sequence at your discretion. As Rebecca began putting the experimental aircraft through its paces, she thought about the letter she'd received that morning. It was from Maria Santos, the soldier whose life had been saved by their dangerous mountain flight. Maria was thriving, working as a civilian contractor and raising her twin boys. The letter included photos of Joshua and Marcus at a school science fair where they'd built a model airplane and told their classmates about the brave pilot who'd saved their mother's life. The evaluation flight went perfectly. The prototype responded to every input with precision, demonstrating capabilities that would revolutionize military aviation. As Rebecca brought the aircraft back to Edwards for landing, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the flight line. Colonel Peterson waited by the hangar as she completed her post-flight procedures. Beside him stood a woman Rebecca didn't recognize, an older African-American woman in civilian clothes with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Outstanding flight, Sergeant Hayes, Peterson said as Rebecca approached. I'd like you to meet Dr. Michelle Washington, Director of Advanced Flight Programs at NASA. Dr. Washington stepped forward with a warm smile. Sergeant Hayes, I've been following your work with great interest. Your unconventional approach to flight dynamics has caught the attention of people at the highest levels of aerospace development. Thank you, ma'am. I'm here to make you an offer, Dr. Washington continued. NASA is developing a new experimental program, civilian test pilots for spacecraft designed for Mars exploration. We need pilots who can think outside conventional parameters, who can adapt to impossible situations. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. Spacecraft? The next generation of human space exploration requires pilots who can do more than follow procedures. We need aviators who can improvise, adapt, and fly by instinct when technology fails. Dr. Washington's eyes held the same intensity Rebecca had seen in Peterson's that day on the mountain base. Your performance in crisis situations suggests you might be exactly what we're looking for. Peterson nodded approvingly. It would mean leaving the Air Force, transferring to civilian status with NASA. But Rebecca, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Rebecca looked up at the sky where she'd just tested the future of atmospheric flight. Somewhere beyond that, blue expanse lay worlds that humans had never touched, challenges that would dwarf anything she'd faced in Earth's atmosphere. When do I start? Dr. Washington laughed. I like your attitude. There'll be extensive training, psychological evaluations, physical conditioning. But if you complete the program successfully, you could be among the first humans to pilot aircraft on another planet. As the three of them walked toward the hangar, Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Torres, now serving as a flight instructor at a base in Colorado. Saw the news about your NASA opportunity. Remember what I told you. You belong wherever there's flying to be done. Go touch the stars. That evening, Rebecca sat in her quarters writing her acceptance letter to NASA. On her desk lay two items that had become her most treasured possessions: the handwritten note from Maria Santos and a photograph of the crew from Cargo 77, taken the day after their mountain landing. Torres, Brennan, and Walsh grinned at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders, while Rebecca stood, slightly apart, not isolated but independent. 3 years ago, she'd been a forgotten pilot buried in logistics. 6 months ago, she'd been a cargo escort nobody expected to notice. Tonight, she was preparing for training that could take her to the stars. The military had tried to limit her based on outdated assumptions about what women could accomplish. But Rebecca had learned something important during those dark years of being underestimated. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody sees coming. She sealed the letter and looked out her window at the night sky. Somewhere up there, Mars waited, a world where atmospheric conditions would make Earth's mountain weather seem gentle, where the margin for error would be measured in the survival of humanity's first interplanetary colonists. It was exactly the kind of impossible challenge Rebecca Hayes had been born to meet. Her story wasn't about proving she belonged in a man's world. It was about proving that skill, courage, and determination belonged to anyone willing to develop them, regardless of what others expected. And now those qualities were going to take her farther than anyone had ever imagined possible. Epilogue. 2 years later. From the Houston Chronicle, Science section, NASA announces first Mars atmospheric flight crew. Former Air Force Sergeant Rebecca Hayes selected to pilot experimental aircraft on Mars surface missions, Houston, NASA. Announced today that Rebecca Hayes, 31, will serve as primary pilot for the Mars Atmospheric Research Vehicle, MARV, making her the first person selected to fly powered aircraft on another planet. Hayes, a former Air Force pilot who gained recognition for executing a dangerous mountain landing during adverse weather conditions, completed NASA's experimental flight training program with the highest scores in program history. Rebecca represents everything we need in a Mars pilot, said Dr. Michelle Washington, Director of Advanced Flight Programs. She has demonstrated the ability to adapt to impossible conditions and make life-or-death decisions under pressure. The MARV program will launch as part of the Mars Colony Initiative in 2027. Hayes and her crew will establish the first aerial transportation network on Mars, supporting scientific research and colony development. When asked about her journey from cargo escort to Mars pilot, Hayes was characteristically understated. Sometimes the best opportunities come from being underestimated. It gives you the freedom to exceed expectations. Hayes credits her air, force crew, Technical Sergeant Michael Torres, Captain Thomas Brennan, and Senior Airman Daniel Walsh, with supporting her during the career transition that launched her path to NASA. They believed in my abilities when it mattered most, Hayes said. That kind of trust changes everything. The MARV team will begin final preparation training next month at Johnson Space Center. If successful, Hayes will become the first human to pilot powered flight on Mars, opening a new chapter in human space exploration. For a woman who was once told she didn't belong in the cockpit, Rebecca Hayes is about to make history by flying where no human has flown before. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one no one saw coming. If you enjoyed this incredible journey of Rebecca Hayes from underestimated cargo escort to Mars pilot, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We share amazing real-life stories of courage, determination, and people who refuse to let others define their limits. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been underestimated because of your gender, age, or background? Share your story with us. What did you think of Rebecca's transformation? Which part of her journey inspired you most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this story if it moved you. Your support helps us bring more incredible, true stories to light. Stay tuned for more everyday life stories where ordinary people do extraordinary things. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that happen when nobody's watching, until someone brave enough steps up to make a difference.